Hello, I'm Frank Duffy of the Hungry Celluloid Podcast show. And last week I had the honour and pleasure of interviewing horror legend Ramsey Campbell. On the podcast with me was author and editor Trevor Kennedy and also author and non-fiction writer Ben Unsworth. Now, as is per usual with me and the guests that I invite onto the podcast, I typically forgot to introduce them, and I did the same thing with Ramsey. But I thought that seeing this is Ramsey, I think I should do a better introduction for him. In fact, do an introduction for him since I didn't do one in the first place. So here is a brief overview of Ramsey's work. Ramsey Campbell was born in 1946, and at the tender age of 15, he had his first collection, The Inhabitant of the Lake, published by the legendary Arkham House. Since then, he has been one of the most prolific writers in the horror and weird fiction genre, and is responsible for some of the most important and seminal works of that genre. He has had several film adaptations of his work, and he is a very familiar face at conventions both on British soil and abroad. On a personal note, Ramsey is one of the friendliest people in the genre and is responsible for helping many young authors at the time and even today get their start. So I'd like to say thank you, Ramsey, for taking part in last week's podcast, and thank you to Trevor and Ben also for joining me. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed the podcast. Bye-bye. And Ramsey Campbell, welcome and thank you for joining us on today's podcast.
My pleasure, my pleasure.
And Trevor and Ben, again, thank you for joining me on the podcast and making me look better than I deserve to be. Thank you.
Not at all, Frank, and it's always great to be here.
Good. And don't be afraid to jump in and ask Ramsey questions. Don't leave it to just me. You guys have got your own questions. Okay, so Ramsey, in the first part, what I would like to do is actually get a flavour of what it was like when you were growing up, what Liverpool was like, the attitudes, the times, because as you know, every writer is formed by every experience, just like people who are not writers. But I think it's something that I'd really like to explore with you. So can you tell me something about what it was like growing up in the 1950s in Liverpool?
Well, in one sense, I mean, I'm not going to say do this, but I would say one way of learning that is read the first volume of my trilogy, because that draws considerably on memories of that time. But no, I shall answer your question properly. Well, let's start at the beginning. I mean, I was not born in, but I was certainly brought up in a garden suburb in Liverpool, the Wavertree Garden suburb, which is off Thingwall Road. It's a splendid name. I used to look for the thing behind the wall, but never saw it, sadly, because it's a translation of the Viking. It doesn't mean that at all. And it was an extremely small house. I mean, I look behind, well, I don't look behind me, but if you could see any of you behind me in my workroom, I guess you could fit most of the ground floor of that house in Nook Rise in Liverpool into this room of mine now. It was very dinky, very, very compact. And somehow they managed to cram in 3 bedrooms upstairs plus a shared bathroom and toilet. That is, shared in the sense of, the one room for both functions. Add to this that a very early age, about 3 years old, I suppose, not much older than that, my parents were estranged. They had this terrible argument, mainly over me, and specifically over the fact that my father had taken me out one Sunday, as he always did. This Sunday he'd taken me off to Broad Green Station, the railway station, and had apparently crossed the line, at the end of the platform, rather than using the overhead bridge. And as I understand it, I mean, this I used to remembering this, but now I'm just basically recycling what I've written down about it years ago, an autobiographical essay. He apparently was told off by some fellow commuters and came home and told my mother all about this. Apparently, a sort of spirit of fun or boasting, which didn't her at all. They got into a physical fight. Eventually, she shoved her hand through a pane of glass on the front door and cut herself horribly. Was taken off to hospital, and when it came to the following week, basically, I was asked, do you want to go out with your father today? Now, at 3 years old, basically, I felt, well, am I going to cause? I mean, it seemed to be in some way it was my fault. I'd caused this whole upheaval. So I said no, and chose my mother in that moment. And after this, I virtually never saw my father again for, I suppose 20 years. But he still lived in the same house. And just to remind you how small it was, so he was a constant presence in the house, but he's also wholly unseen. And he was the turning doorknob and the footsteps that came up at night, up the stairs at night while I lay in bed in something of a panic because my mother had persuaded me that my father was this sort of monstrous figure who was quite capable of murdering us in our beds. Add to this, which tells you a little bit about my mother, but sadly, there's much more to tell. And I was very young when I realized that what my mother perceived and reality were not necessarily the same things. And so, the radio show, The Archers, which I suspect, many people are still aware of, that was not really written by neighbors in the street under a pseudonym, and it wasn't really full of coded messages about her and her life. And I had to sort this out, as a toddler, really. So this was kind of, my everyday experience. It was also, a very polite suburb. I always remember one thing about this. I think it's gone away now. I hope so anyway. But people would never say good day. If you happen to pass through the street, they would hum. Have a little song which kind of seemed to imply, I'm inside myself. Don't disturb me, or don't be so rude as to say hello to me. Or I'm not absolutely sure. Or maybe it just meant you are a young person. You must not speak to me. I really don't know. So this was my early experience, and I really didn't get out very much beyond the immediate environs of the suburb. But then, gradually I extended my range. I was walking off in Liverpool to various places, not least to the local public library, which is up in Childwall, which is I suppose a couple of miles away. It's a decent sort of a walk. Now, my mother was allowing me to use her adult tickets in the public library from the time I was 6 years old. And so I was borrowing lots of adult fiction, and specifically, I was already homing in on anything that was in any way fantastic or macabre. And I'm pretty sure the first book I ever borrowed was 50 Years of Ghost Stories. It included M.R. James, included Edith Wharton. So here I am reading Edith Wharton when I'm 6 years old. Afterwards, specifically, is the story. Because I was also horribly precocious. I mean, Wilbur Whately in the Dulwich Horror had nothing on me, I'll tell you. And science fiction I was borrowing, August Earth anthologies. The only thing interesting, because the librarians presumably didn't ever think, hang on, he's a bit young for that. The only time when somebody behind the counter said, oh no, not for you, was Gogol, Dead Souls. And,
yes,
it sounded to me like which in fact it does have certain, ghostly elements in it, but that was why I borrowed it. But no, you mustn't have that too adult for you. Apparently Edgar Allan Poe wasn't, though, the Telltale, that's fine. Lovecraft, Color Out of Space when I was 8, that's fine. Although it almost wasn't for me because I felt it was so disturbing. I genuinely thought if my mother looks over my shoulder and sees what I'm reading, she said, oh no, put that away. That's going too far. And actually, even at that age, I did feel, Lovecraft is pushing beyond my comfort zone. But, and of course, this is what separates the aficionado from other folk. Once I recovered somewhat from the experience, I wanted to do it again. So that, like the rest of us, you see, we're all terrible, warped, masochistic people, basically.
Can I just
that was a very long answer to a very short question.
No. This is the thing I wanted to really look at. I wanted to ask you a question because I remember when actually trying to get your books out at the library and Stephen King's books, there were two librarians. One was young and she'd let me do it. and the other one would make me put the books back. And there was some of your books, yeah. And I'd already started reading you by that stage.
Yeah.
So I must have been about 11 or 12, and this woman was still very strict. But that was the 1980s, and you're talking.
I've been banned then at last. My ambition realized.
In Rainford Library, that's where it was.
I can buy a happy man now.
Sorry, Ben.
So, somebody's had some sense at last to ban him.
Yeah. Not before time.
But what I wanted to ask was, because I was quite surprised that you said that they allowed you to do that until you got the Gogol book. Because when you look at a lot of films and when you hear people speak about those times, you would think it was more prurient, that they were much stricter than they were in the 1980s. But it seems to be the reverse, unless my case is just an isolated case. So what was it really like in those days, though? Were people actually a lot more flexible about what you read, or was it because you had really good librarians?
I think it's probably a really good librarian, actually, and also maybe they thought, it's fantastic, it's in a way, it's fantastic fiction, whether it be horror, science fiction, or well, there wasn't very much fantasy at all, really. You could find Mervyn Peake and Tolkien, and that was about your lot in the adult library in those days. In other ways, in other terms, oh gosh, no, anything but. I mean, do remember that these are the days when Lady Chatterley was being seized by customs, and everything and anything more than that, very much more so. And so it became a court case in the very would have been 1960, I think, wouldn't it? As I remember it, approximately. I can't, without looking it up, I'm not absolutely sure, but it was certainly in my very early teens that I remember that there was this. All of a sudden, there was this forbidden book that was freely available in W.H. Smith. I still remember, actually venturing into W.H. Smith a couple of times, kind of, veering toward the book and stretching out my hand and thinking, can I do this? And I couldn't quite. And, I scuttled away again, terrified of, what I might bring down on my head. I bet I did buy it, but there's another story.
Yeah.
What about I was asking Trevor this when Trevor was on the podcast about attitudes towards what's acceptable reading materials then. So what were the attitudes about? I mean, I know I've read a lot of what you've written about this and you've talked about it a lot, but I'd still like to just ask you about it. The actual attitudes that time on the streets, in the shops, in the pubs, in the homes, at the schools, how much of it was it a talking point where you were told, the teachers, for example, made a point of because I know you went to a Catholic school like me, they made a point of telling you this is evil, this is bad for you. How much of that was really around you at the time?
I think I was aware of it. I'm not particularly certain of being told it by not on the whole by the teaching staff. Oh, well, no, there were a couple of incidents when I think about this, although just to go back to my mother, who was also a Catholic, that black magic, you mustn't read about that. So any book with black magic in it, until my early teens, really. I remember the Montague Summers Supernatural Omnibus has a section in it about black magic. Oh no, don't read those stories. Well, of course I did, but covertly. And here I am to tell you, so I must have survived in some sense. The school, it wasn't particularly a sort of moral issue that I remember so much as an issue of literary snobbery, as I remember.
Yeah.
Because you see, I recall, for instance, at grammar school, certainly in the later years of my 5 years there, we had a period each week of just reading. You could bring in a book and read it theoretically. I remember one time I was reading the Shrinking Man, Richard Madison, and I was more, had a finger very wagged at me, and put that away. Next week I came in with Ray Bradbury's The Day It Rained Forever. Oh, that's all right. That's obviously literature. Well, these two guys are exactly. They were two writers in the California, the California school of the fantastic Matheson and Bradbury, and great friends. So little because one was in paperback and the other, in hardcover. That was the legitimating factor. I don't know. I do remember having. Hang on. I'm being told by my computer. There we are. It's gone now. The alarm has gone. Was that audible? Okay.
It doesn't matter. Don't worry, Ramsey.
Oh, don't worry. All right. Fair enough. I remember it was a magazine called Phantom, that was published in Britain. Well, it ran for 16 issues, 1957, 1958. And its latter issues tended to reprint most of its material from Weird Tales from the late 40s, early 50s. And I remember reading one issue in class, and in one of these periods, obviously, I remember the precise one, it was issue number 14, which had in it The High Tower by Everdell Worrell. And I remember that was seized by Brother Engel. Brother Engel, not because with the friend of Marx, presumably, but he was very disapproving and took it away and put it in his desk, and I never saw it again. And it's very frustrating because I've collected most of the wretched magazine since, but that appears to be the rarest issue. So damn, I'll never have it again.
Yeah. What about what I'm going to let Ben and Trevor ask you a question because I know they've got questions. I just want to ask you one quick question about that. I went to a Catholic all-boys school, and it was the De La Salle order. What order was it in your school?
It was the Christian Brothers, a deranged bunch. Not all of them, obviously, but too many. There seemed to be quite a strong sadistic element to quite a bunch of them, basically.
The De La Salle was similar to that.
I mean, Catholics are just they're based on how much can we guilt you in a short space of time.
Or slip you.
I mean, some people would pay for that, but that's a different matter.
Trevor, Ben, you wanted to ask Ramsey a question. Trevor,
I'll let you go first.
Yes. No. I've just sort of go back to what Ramsey was saying. For myself, growing up, and yourself as well, Frank, growing up in a Protestant area of Belfast in the 1980s, there was still quite conservative attitudes towards not so much the fantastic, as Ramsey was saying, or things that were perceived as the fantastic, but certainly anything to do with sex or potentially Satanism or anything. It was very much off limits. It was, you're not allowed anywhere near that. But things like the more fantastic, say, Lovecraft or such, or even just, ghost stories, were pretty okay, and they were allowed. So, I think there would have been a lot of similarities, certainly back then with myself growing up with the whole sort of Protestant sort of Christian ethos, as well as the Catholic, where there is that type of sort of, as Ben said, guilting you into things, or trying to guilt you to stay away from things, that sort of thing. But no, I'm going to ask.
Just to cut in for a moment. I mean, it just occurs to me, it was even more widespread than that, because the British Board of Film classification, well, the British Board of Film censors, as it was back in the 50s, they wouldn't allow black magic in movies. Or they were very, very wary of it. Now, I seem to remember the only thing that was cut out of Night of the Demon was apparently some sort of an image of witchcraft. I think they may even tone down a bit of the dialogue about it. And so it was, it was quite an event when something like Devil Rides Out comes along. But that's several years later, represents a real softening of their attitude.
Because I remember you saying about this before, about Night of the Demon. I'm actually surprised that they didn't cut out at the opening when I forgot the name of the character, but he is enmeshed in the electric wires when the demon's coming, because that's quite explicit. That's quite explicit for the times. I was I'm surprised they didn't cut that out. So it shows you that it seems to be a lot of confusion about what they thought was good for you and what's not good for you. As you say, with Matheson you can't read, but Bradbury you can read. And it shows you that they didn't actually really know what it was they were offended by, which is... which is
There
just
was confusion there. I think even the title, I'm surprised it didn't have issues with that. With the word demon, even.
Yes.
Ben, did you want to ask Ramsey a question in this section?
Well, so I mean, we've sort of talked about this before as well, but there's a lot of, obviously, in your work, kind of, like, especially in recent years, it's a lot of like people being dysfunctional.
Yes.
Yeah. Like, was there a public element to your parents kind of like falling out? Like, were people looking at you going like, oh, he comes from the weird home?
Oh
Or
no, I
was
don't
it
think so.
fairly
No,
private there?
no, I think some of the neighbours may have been a bit aware that my mother was not, entirely on a sort of a balanced level, if you will. But I mean, occasionally she, I think she made this apparent. But no, she kept it very much to herself. And also, and I don't. Sounds sort of melodramatic, but I actually don't think it is an overstatement to say she sort of indoctrinated me against telling anybody at all about her or her condition, or even talking about her to anybody, which strongly suggests that she was somewhat aware of her own condition, or at least of how it might be perceived. But having said this, I gather that very early on in the marriage, my father threatened to have her sectioned. Now, to what extent that was, just a kind of an element in his arsenal, in terms of their conflict. To what extent it was the actual proposal, I genuinely don't know. But I think she must have been aware of this as a possibility. So she wanted to make absolutely certain that nobody was kind of tipped off in that fashion. But no, they were never. To my knowledge, certainly, from when I remember. It's an interesting question. I can't remember ever seeing them together in public. No, not outside the house, and not for very long, in it either. Given this, catastrophic split.
Yeah. No, it's just 'cause, especially I was thinking with your most recent novel, like it's very much about, well, but actually both of your recent two novels, but it's very much about what other people think of you, mixed with kind of like actually your own version of reality slightly breaking.
Yes. Oh, yes.
Well,
I think that's been present. I mean, look all the way back to something like Thieving Fear. That's central, crucial to it, I think.
noticed that as a recurring theme throughout your work, Ramsey. Awkward family relationships and
Oh,
sort
yeah.
of, sometimes darkly humorous. Sometimes
Oh,
you're
yes.
sort of
Well,
you're there with and very tense.
yes. Well, I think I write comedy, as I often say. I wish people laughed more at my stuff.
Yeah. Well, no, it's just I mean, for my money, as it were, I think that dysfunction element has got stronger over the years in your work, actually.
Yes,
You know, I as in, if you think, there's less of a monster element in
yes,
recent stuff. It's that, the horror comes purely from dysfunction as
yes,
opposed to earlier
From the
ones.
people, the characters, yeah.
Yeah.
Although I would think by the time you started writing Cold Print, I think that's already heavily embedded in your work. I think it's just evolved over time. Because with age, we all change but I think we keep to certain themes. But I'm jumping ahead because I still have some questions for you about the times. What about expectations and attitudes towards gender and occupations? Because we live in a very different world. I mean, Trevor and I also live in a very different world to the one we grew up in. For Ben, because he's much younger, he's born into this world, but he knows a lot about what went before. I know that. But what would you say about gender and occupations? What you were told you could and you couldn't do, and how to speak to people?
Oh well. I mean, in terms of how to speak to people and how to behave. I mean, these were still the days when you supposedly stood up when anybody female or any lady entered the room, which I found bizarre. And you stood for the national anthem at the end of the movies, unless you were one of the lucky ones about to scuttle out before the damn thing started. Otherwise, people would stand in your way, and prevent you from leaving. And oh yes, you must address your elders, in an appropriate way. And any sort of sexual ambiguity was, well, I wouldn't say it was, well, it's very odd, this, because, on the one hand, if you were found out to be gay, or if you were certainly, caught in any sort of, gay activity, then, it was you for the law courts when I was there, up to my early teens. And yet at the same time, there was certainly at least one master at my grammar school. I won't name it because, he probably isn't even with us any longer. I strongly suspect he is not. But he was very, very, very openly camp. And, there was no question. I mean, as much as Julian and Sandy on, Round the Horn or whichever Thorne show it was in those days, he was as much as open as that. I had really no idea whether it was because it could be interpreted as a kind of performance that people were left unsure. But I mean, none of us were unsure. Believe you me, none of the boys were remotely unsure. And I can't imagine that any of his colleagues were either. But somehow this was out in the open, and yet ignored. Presumably the implication being that. It just as long as you simply performed it but didn't do anything about it, at least not openly, not where you could be, noticed, then that was let go. It's a very curious time in those terms when I think about it, and I've never. I mean, looking back now, it seemed just to be the way things were at the time. But like God knows my childhood, I thought, well, this is how life is. It was only very gradual. Well, hang on, I isn't like that for other people, or remotely like that. But at the time, I just took it for granted. And this whole odd taking for granted of things that were certainly, illegal if you got caught at them. Was an odd contradiction that now I look back on it, deserves more investigation just to see how it worked,
Because when you talk about it being a performance, and then you look at the films of that period, and if you show a film from that period to someone, not with Ben's knowledge of films, but someone who's not interested in cinema, inevitably you hear them talk about, people are very theatrical in the films in those days. And then Brando came along and then it started to change. Yeah. Would you say that one of the reasons that people probably never spoke about it or acknowledged it was that there were so many people in real life who were theatrical, which is why it was kind of like echoed and repeated in films, because people at the time weren't looking at films unless it was a really bad actor and saying this is theatrical. That's what they knew, and that's how life was. Was it because people were much larger than life characters in those days?
That may be true. Yes, actually, you're perfectly right. And funnily enough, you immediately remind me of Robert Aikman, the good old Robert Aikman. Sadly long gone. But one of the comments I've always remembered is he said there are no vivid men anymore. So clearly the implication being that there were a lot in his past, and in the past I recognise too. And yes, there has been that sort of falling away to a certain extent, because if you don't have, if you're accepted, you don't have to perform it anymore.
Yeah.
As the theatre tradition has changed as well, because now, how easy is it for us to go to the cinema? It's it's right there. Whereas probably your generation, it was far the day out, as it were, was far more to go to the theatre. Yeah. So kind of your experience of characters was probably more likely in a theatre surrounding anyway.
Yes, and obviously the sort of theatrical performance rather than the cinematic performance, which would tend to be more understated, I think, on the part of most actors. Which kind of brings me to something else I haven't really talked about, in terms of my experience of Liverpool. That when I turned 14, I became hugely interested in the cinema in a way that I hadn't been before. And one reason was, I have to explain to you this, that I was able to bluff my way past the X certificate, which in those days meant, theoretically you had to be 16 or pass for 16 to see any X movie. Now, when I say any X movie, virtually any horror film had an X, and by this I mean Plan 9 from Outer Space, and I mean the giant claw And I mean Godzilla versus, the giant octopus, or, whatever many creatures Godzilla took on might have been.
Bride of the Monster with Bela
Bride of the
Lugosi fighting with an
Monster.
octopus.
Oh yes, Bride of the Monster.
Yeah.
I mean, Glenda was actually banned by the BBFC for many years, but that's a different matter. And all the old Bela Lugosi, not just Plan 9, but the corpse vanishes and all this sort of thing. Oddly enough, there's one little group of horror movies that didn't get an X, although to my mind are far more frightening and disturbing are films like The Cat People, the original Jack Turner, or The Leopard Man was uncut with an A certificate, but because they were understated, but even so, they were far more committed to dread than most horror films. But they got away with it because of.
I mean, The Leopard Man, the shot of the blood.
Yes.
Under the door, that to me is a far more terrifying image than so many other films.
Absolutely, it was Robert Bloch's favourite scene in a horror film. So there you are.
It seems to be more about excess, doesn't it, rather than subtlety?
Yeah.
Because the subtlety of Turner and Luton on those kinds of people, I mean, it's far more insidious. It's far more adult. It has a much deeper reach. Maybe it's because they thought kids would be more affected by the obvious than not being able to pick up on the other stuff. But when you look back, you realize which film really should. Yes. None of them should have had an X. But if you were going to have that argument, it would be this and not that. Which just adds fuel to the fire about how confused people were about what actually affects people and how much people were turned away from the truth and reality. Because I was going to ask you a question about in your neighborhood, how many people also do you think behind closed doors had their own sensitive family problems that were not publicly aired? Do you think it would have been many people or a few people?
Oh, I think quite a number, actually. I mean, but one can only speculate. But I mean, I do remember, for instance, that you see, in these days things were not diagnosed in many cases.
Yeah,
I mean, there was certainly a chap, but I cannot now remember his name. But I should just explain that the setup of where I lived. You can look on Google Maps if you like, and you can take a 3D trip around the place if you want to. But look, rise, it was in the strange form of an inverted cross. Make that it's fine. How appropriate is that? There you go. It had two cul-de-sacs which were linked, crossing another road, a longer main, or not main road, but a longer side road. And at the other cul-de-sac, the other end of this duo, I do remember there was one chap who was a bit older than me, and what one heard, via gossip. My mother had heard about this. I think that he didn't eat at the same table as his parents. Now, whether it was some sort of mental condition of his or some sort of permanent estrangement, I have no idea. But as you suggest, I suspect there was a lot more of that sort of, in a general sense, that sort of situation was a lot more common and a lot less acknowledged than we know.
Before we go into part two, Trevor, I know that you wanted to ask Ramsey a question connected to part one.
Yeah, I was just really going to sort of back up what you, Frank, and Ramsey were talking about, how, back, when we were growing up and whenever Ramsey was growing up, you were asking, Frank, you think that there were maybe issues in other households and, stuff like that. I would say perhaps every household and family had their issues that certainly back when I was growing up, things would have been not discussed or swept under the carpet more as opposed to today where things are a lot more open. So yeah, I think that more, every household would have its sort of issues to varying extents, obviously,
I think it also comes down to class. Because according to sociologists today, the British class system has kind of collapsed into 7 different class systems because you've got rich marrying people from working class backgrounds. but I know coming from a working class background, having lived in working class neighborhoods, that people might have communicated in a much more different way outside of the home. So it was more common knowledge. Ramsey, was that your experience, that it depended on the class, or do you think it wasn't like that?
Well, I didn't have a great deal of experience of the various classes really at that stage, so it's difficult to know.
And Ben, did you have something you wanted to ask as well? I think you
did. I think that actually sort of covers it, because I was just going to say, like, kind of how did it kind of like at school, were there kind of like, so for want of a better phrase, cliques within that?
Oh yes, yes.
Yeah.
It wasn't necessarily based on class, I would think. I mean, all sorts of different things. I mean, I had friends, luckily, who also read science fiction and fantasy and horror, so that we tend to be one little bunch, not a great big one, but some.
No, it's just because I find it's weird nowadays. Actually, a lot of the people who frown at my liking horror or don't particularly understand it are actually, often it's just as much people my own age, and you'd expect like my generation to at least be like, okay, well, it's just a thing like any other.
Yeah.
But yeah, I still find it's as much kind of like we're considered like a horror kind of like, the horror people as much by my generation as it is by those who were brought up in a more conservative time.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I found personally when I was at school, there was obviously still, the cliques there of the jocks, as I would call them, the sort of rugby and football guys, and then the more nerdy ones. Although I was very much a nerd and a reader, and I belonged to the chess club and stuff like that, I sort of, I suppose at that age, a lot of us just want to fit in. So I found that the balance between sort of fitting in with both crowds was becoming a bit of a clown and a bit of a joker and a bit of a sort of crazy one at school. So that was sort of accepted by both sides, that sort of thing. But yeah, I remember sort of always trying to strike that balance with the sort of the mates that I hung about with, who were more of the cool ones, so to speak, who would have been into sports and stuff like that. But my real passions were also with the more sort of nerdy ones, for want of a better phrase.
Sure.
It will not surprise you to know that I have never ever fitted in.
Right. Well, nor did I.
I never tried to.
No,
certainly not with sport. Sport was an unknown territory for me.
Yes, I used to invent diseases to get out of it.
Oh, you're not the only one, Ben. Don't worry. That stretches back decades. Not wanting to do gym. Did you have a tag at school, Ramsey? Like, no, Ramsey's the guy who reads a lot of books, but he reads these books.
I'm not aware of it. I'm sure there may have been things said, but who knows what they are? Perhaps it's better not to know.
Right, we're going to move into part two. And part two, I want to talk to you about writing, publishing your books. Obviously, it's going to be absolutely impossible to talk about everything that you've done. So Trevor and Ben have got their own questions. I've got my own specific questions I want to talk to you about, but I'm going to let Ben start. So Ben, what would be your first question for Ramsey about his career in writing and publishing?
Well, I suppose because this is the first question, I suppose let's do a slightly more open one. What do you feel kind of like is your most I don't know how to phrase it. Come back to me. Trevor, you go first.
My question would sort of be jumping ahead as well, but I'll ask it anyway. Ramsey, you've been published since the 1960s, 7 decades, I believe,
since the invention of printing, I have. Yeah, go on.
Yeah. But yes, how do you stay fresh? Because your stuff is fresh,
Yeah, it is.
And how, after so much experience within the field, and consistently, writing novels and short stories and nonfiction as well. How do you? Is there a way of that you personally keep fresh? That you work at to keep fresh within
I mean, hell's teeth. Only doing my best not to repeat myself, because of course you do anyway. But I try to come up with something that I haven't done before, and I kind of hope that nobody's done before. And so increasingly, I try to home in on those ideas for development that don't seem to me to have been overdone.
Yes.
But also, I suppose the other way is I've tried to kind of refine what I'm doing, if you like. I mean, one great favourite writer of mine is Graham Greene. I think
Yes.
in one way, he spent a lot of his career, or at least throughout his career, he seems to me to pare away his method, to refine his prose. And I've tried to do that too, really. So, one thing I am aware of, I think, rereading very early stuff when it's reissued, is that these days I tend to be sparer, if you like, as a writer, but still, I'm trying to achieve the same ends basically, but perhaps more economically. So maybe that's part of what it is. But really, the honest answer is I don't know. I mean, it's all instinct really, and
natural instinct. Yeah.
If I did know, I'd probably seize up and not be able to do it. So I don't look too closely at the process.
I would actually say, just to follow on from what Trevor was saying, in my opinion, having read literally everything you've done, and so I've got a very good timeline to look at, and I've been rereading a lot of your books recently, the earlier books, but I would actually say that you've got better with each book, which I think is unusual, because the tendency tends to be a lot of pressure on whether you're an artist, whether you're a musician or a writer, that, oh, they should quit now. It wasn't as good as it was in the beginning. I honestly, and I mean this without trying to, bend over and kiss ass here, but I honestly think that you have got better and better with each collection and with each novel, which I think is unusual. Ben, did you want to add to what I was saying, or did you want to jump to your next question? Sorry to just throw it at you like that.
Well, you could disagree and say, no, actually, you're writing shit.
I mean, just speaking personally, I think your more recent stuff, because it's it's more anxiety horror now.
Yes.
And I prefer that to slightly more. I love a good monster fiction or a good piece of Lovecraftian fiction, but I do prefer kind of the anxiety horror of kind of people just disagreeing and getting on each other's nerves.
A comedy of paranoia, that's what it is.
Yeah.
And I would say that's also as a reader, it's much more relatable. I mean, I love a good monster or vampire or whatever, or ghoul. But at the same time, the more sort of relatable stuff would be the sort of comedy of anxiety, or or the familial tensions and that sort of thing.
Very much. Now, can I just throw one thing in here quickly? Have you guys seen the film Beau is Afraid?
I haven't yet. Not yet.
Ari Aster. Yeah. Ari Aster.
See it. It's my favorite comedy of paranoia. I mean, I've never seen it done so well.
I'm really liking his Hereditary. Yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of people were put off, weren't they, though, by the fact that he wasn't doing what they wanted him to do, and he'd done this completely different film. Even if there are huge amounts of connection between the films.
Yes.
Whereas actually, I really like Beau is Afraid because I wasn't that keen on Hereditary and Midsummer. So I liked that he went in a completely different direction, because it actually felt like, oh, he's now a director I can watch, as opposed to someone I'm just sitting here going like, okay, and when are you going to get to the bit I like?
Yeah. I really liked Hereditary, especially at the time. I was a little disappointed with Midsummer, although I've only watched it once, so I would have to watch it again to be fair. But I think he was on record as saying that he only has so many horror stories or horror films in him. So I think that perhaps explains more as well why he went in a different direction. But I haven't seen Beau is Not Afraid yet, but I will check it out.
Mark Kermode makes a very good argument for the fact that Midsummer isn't a horror film, and that he thinks Ari Aster himself might be open to that conjecture that it isn't. But I'm sorry to do this. Can we just go back a little bit? Because I want to go against the grain of what Ben and Trevor was saying about a good monster story. I want to say that the psychology of the paranoia and the misunderstandings and the anxiety that Ben's talking about has always been prevalent in your work. Perhaps not in the early stories of the inhabitants of the lake, but you were 15 and 16 years of age when you were writing those stories.
Yeah.
So I would say already by Demons by Daylight, and especially by Cold Print, if you look at a character like Strut in Cold Print, you've already invested those characters with, in this case, the alienation and wanting something from other people and not being able to get it because you can't communicate very well with people. I think that psychology is already there in those early stories. So when you were moving along in your career, this is always probably the stupidest question to ask a writer who doesn't plan, but was that at all ever at the foreground? Like actively, were you saying to yourself, I need to investigate that more? Or was it just a natural progression from the inhabitants of the lake to Cold Print and thinking in this way?
I think, yeah, it's more like a natural progression. I mean, in the sense that, I finished writing The Inhabitant. I was the final story in that book, The Moon Lens.
Yeah.
I was just turning 17. Now, I should explain, that when I read Lovecraft in Quantity when I was 14, the first British paperback collection that had ever been published, actually, because there had been none until 1960. This became the example I wanted to emulate, and so I did in that first book. Having finished it, I actually felt, well, I'm not sure that I put it into words to that extent to myself, but certainly the feeling was, I've done this now. I want to move on. I want to do something else now. And I'm a great believer in the happy coincidence in terms of writing. And as it happened, I happened upon, I keep saying happened, don't I? So for whatever reason, so I thought I would never do this in written prose. I can tell you that. But I came upon a copy of Lolita on the station bookstall in just about the end of 62. And now, in those days, it had a reputation of being a naughty book, a bit of a forbidden text. But at the same time, there was a recommendation on the back by Graham Greene. So I thought, that justifies buying it anyway. But I was still buying it partly because I thought, this is a kind of transgressive book. And I suppose I read just a few pages and I read just how much more there was there than I was anticipating. And that then became my notion of what I wanted to do. It had this hugely liberating effect on me. Now, I won't go into much more detail about Nabokov because we're going to talk about him later on.
Yeah.
But suffice to say that at this point, I then began to think, well, I want to bring more of what I love about the mainstream into my horror fiction. I suppose that was part of it. And so the stories in Demons by Daylight came about. And incidentally, PS Publishing, in a couple of months, they're going to be doing the definitive edition of Demons by Daylight, including all the first drafts, which were very substantially rewritten. And so I wrote Demons by Daylight, and that took me 5 years off and on, not doing some, I was still sort of full-time day job. Before it was completed, I was working in Liverpool Public Libraries. And I finished Demons by Daylight, and then I thought, well, I've come to the end of this now, and what do I do? And I really sort of floundered about for a little bit, I think, with writing very much more experimental stories, a few of which are okay, and then returning to some extent to more traditional methods and more traditional narratives, and eventually put together a third collection. And from that point onward, I think I became sure of what I was doing and how to do it, and trying to develop it along those lines. Of course, things are never that simple, but that's a very basic sketch of how I went.
Because I'm going to go back even further in a moment, but I don't want to monopolize everyone's time. So Ben or Trevor, do you have any specific questions for Ramsey before I actually go back and connect it to what Ramsey was just saying?
Well, so I've got two. So just for anyone. So the first one, I suppose, is this is the one I was trying to formulate before. Obviously, your early days, as it were you were tutored by August Derleth.
You're going into my territory.
I'm sorry.
No, I'm joking. I'm joking. It's good.
And obviously Lovecraft was kind of like your access point, as it were. Do you think that changed the way you wrote fiction, kind of writing in someone else's universe to start with?
Oh yes, very much so.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'd already tried a bit. Even younger than that, I was doing Arthur Machen when I was 12, and John Dixon Carr, for heaven's sake, when I was 13. But you can actually see in the Dixon Carr thing that I've read Lovecraft, and gradually Lovecraftian elements begin to creep into, at the very least, into the prose. I mean, not thematically, obviously, because it was supposed to be a detective story, but it gets steadily more gothic and more florid as it progresses. I eventually abandoned that book. But yes, I mean, I think basically it's learning your craft by imitation. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, because I think eventually once you've learned what to do, the skills that you need to I mean, I'm still learning them, don't get me wrong, but learn some of the basics by then. I mean, that then freed me to write much more about what I wanted to talk about, rather than imitating, trying to be Lovecraftian, and even then, trying to convey what I loved about Lovecraft's cosmic horror. I then began to talk about what disturbed me more personally. So the fears and the terrors and the psychological elements in Demons by Daylight are considerably more personal. But that's because I'm equipped to talk about them, I think.
Because Ben's nicely opened up what I wanted to ask you. Sorry, Ben, just one quick sec, because I know I'll forget. You've got a healthy brain, you'll remember. I'll forget. I've got notes and everything. I was reading only yesterday The Inhabitants of the Lake, the reissue by PS Publishing, and I was absolutely fascinated by, at the end of the book, you've got the correspondence between well, no, it's just Derleth replying to your original letters and your manuscripts. And it made me laugh, it made me giggle, because it was such direct, I would say productive criticism.
Oh, yeah.
If that happened today, I think, online, there would be the usual thing online of everybody crying about how dare this editor speak to this person in this way.
Well, you know what? I occasionally post that, part of that long critical letter, editorial letter, online on precisely where you say, these writers groups say, oh, you must be constructive, and you mustn't risk, offending your. Well, if you can't take criticism, don't be a bloody writer.
Yeah. I mean, Trevor and I were speaking about this now, because I know that Trevor's a very decent person and he speaks to people in a very pleasant way, but you struggled with that, didn't you, Trevor, telling people that sometimes you can't accept a story. However, I would say that when I was reading what Derleth had said to you, did you ever feel tempted to say to him, hold on a second, all of this is fantastic for me as a writer, but I am actually only 15, 16 years of age?
Well, no, I didn't, because it was only when he bought the first story of mine that he did use, which was for the anthology Dark Mind, Dark Heart, story called The Church in High Street.
Yeah.
I mean, he actually bought it, but he said he wanted to edit it a bit more.
Yeah, right.
I mean, I wish he'd said to me, look, this is wrong, and I would then have done it in my own way. But fair enough. I mean, and no less an authority than S.T. Joshi says he can't see where I end and Dearth begins in that story. So fair enough. But the thing was that once he'd bought it, he said, he needed a bit of an author note, just a bit of background to put at the front of the head.
Yeah,
I
saw that. Yeah.
And that was when he realized I was, only 16. And he wrote back saying, that was actually the age he was, but he'd sold his first story to Weird Tales. And, he said, well, really? You've got a career ahead. But he did say it was very good advice, don't try and depend on it to earn a living this early. Get a kind of good day job that won't, take up too much of your time, and then write in the spare time. And that's what I did. And quite right, too.
Ben, I interrupted you. So would you like to ask the question again? So.
No, it's just, I mean, speaking as, I mean, you know, I was either 15 when Uneasy Beginnings came out. So again, you know, you and I have something in common in that we started early, as it were. But no, I just, when you were talking about like honing your craft by being in someone else's world, it's something that I actually found really useful, because a lot of my original stories that I wrote were Doctor Who scripts stuff.
Yeah.
So it was kind of, that's when I was trying to work out how it all worked, was I used this world that I knew.
Yes,
And even now, if I'm in a writing kind of rut,
Hmm.
what I do is I write a novelization, even just like a short 20-page one of a film.
Yeah.
So if I'm in a writing rut, I go, right, somebody else has done the work for me. That's the story. I've just got to do the job of putting it onto the page, just to kind of hone it. But no, the other question I was going to ask was, obviously, a lot of writers. I mean, I've started to have this. A lot of people have kind of gone, right. So when's your novel going out? There's a bit of a, I don't want to say prissiness, but there is a bit of a, I think, snobbery around short stories. Like, they're not considered as higher craft as
Well,
novels.
quite wrong. But
Oh, I disagree. But I was going to say, did you ever face that like, you know, people were like, well, we'll take a novel from you, but not, you know.
Oh, well, yes, but not in quite that way. It was much more that when I went full time in 1973, which was like, you know, good heavens, was 9 years after the first book came out, The Inhabitant. In fact, Demons by Daylight had just come out. Ted Klein, the great Ted Klein, had written a long exegesis about that, of that book. And I thought, well, you know, I must be doing something right, because he's got everything I wanted to be in the book. So Jenny and I discussed it, and, you know, it seemed like if I'm going to do it at all, go try and make it now. And so I duly did. Had Jenny then not kept us for 5 years by her teaching, you know, you wouldn't be talking to me right now. But by this time, I had Kirby Macaulay was my American agent, and he was saying basically, look, you can't make a living only writing short stories. You know, you must write a novel. And, you know, he kept, you know, gently but persistently saying, I know soon he would write ... in his letters. And so eventually I did, back in, I think, yeah, well, I began to develop the Dollarwaiter's Mother back in, I think it would have been 74, 75, and, you know, gradually, but, you know, even back then, I wanted to do something that I felt had not been done before, and certainly something I'd not done before. And also, even back then, I knew that the idea had to be substantial enough to be worthy of development as a novel, and not just as a long short story or a novella, you know. And so I did work quite a lot on trying to come up with an idea that I thought was sufficiently good, and eventually off I went and did it. And, you know, the rest we know.
And Trevor?
Yes, Ramsey has pretty much just answered the question that I was going to ask him. I was going to ask originally about August Derleth, but then I was sort of going to reframe it to what, as your career progressed, Ramsey, who had been other sort of constructive critical influences, but you've sort of already answered with Klein and Kirby Macaulay. So perhaps there was maybe others, just as your career progressed through the 70s and into the 80s.
Well, eventually there'll be Carol Smith, who was my British agent, and she
Yes.
came in the, again, let me see, toward the end of the 70s. And yes, she certainly, and she and Kirby together. Well, I should explain, first of all, The Doll was duly published in America. And I remember still Jenny and I and Barbara Norville, who was my editor there, Barbara took us out for dinner, and this was, you know, shortly after The Doll had been published, and we had a very good dinner. And eventually I said, well, you know, because it hadn't really come up, we were all being very, you know, very amiable. So, you know, how is the book, Barbara, doing? Barbara, you know, how is the book doing? And she said, dreadfully. So I said, oh, right. Well, how are the reviews then? And she said, well, there's a bad review and there's a mixed review. So I said, oh, well, show me the mixed review. And she eventually dug out this cutting, or whatever it was, you know. Well, yes, wouldn't it? Because, you know, no computers in those days, like you carried with you. Well, I duly read it, and it said, cardboard characterization, contrived plot, stiff prose, and so I said, well, can I see the mixed review? And she said that was the mixed review. So there you are.
Okay.
And then wrote The Face That Must Die, which I felt was an actual natural progression from the first novel, and I was actually, on the whole, pretty happy with it. And nobody wanted to publish it, and so Kirby and Carol and I then got together by correspondence, to try and come up with a novel, an idea that would sell. And the result was The Parasite, which personally I think is a terrible sort of ramshackle thing that piles far too much in, but people have liked it, and it did do well. And so I was then, I think, freed to write much more the kind of thing that I wanted to write without, on the whole, exterior influence.
I suppose you're dredging all this now, aren't you? You're dredging all now, doing all the reissues through Flame Tree.
Yeah.
You're kind of, I think there's a whole new generation that can see that progress almost anew.
Oh yes, well, Flame Tree are doing a great job, and here's a plug for me, if I may. They've just done Incarnate, as the latest reissue. I must say, having had to comes with the job, obviously, to proofread it. I felt, I didn't feel it was that remote from me. In one way, it felt like somebody else had written it. Somebody 40 years ago had written it, which indeed they had, obviously. But still, I kind of engaged with it, and I've been trying to feel that there's still something back there that deserves, I hope, deserves resurrection.
I felt that when I reviewed it.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you very much.
My review of it is incoming because Flame Tree sent me out an arc. So
I got one as well. Yeah.
Okay.
Because you've written in the introduction to Cold Print about when you've done it a few times, I think, when you mentioned finding Lovecraft's book in the shop window. But, for me, it was when my friends and I used to go, you remember chapter 1 on Wood Street, not Wood Street, London Road in Liverpool.
The road,
remember?
Yes. Don Mottershead, yes.
Yeah, so I remember when...
Goinson, yes. Go on,
I remember when my friend who knew that, I read you, he said, but I didn't have any of your novels. He said that there's a copy of The Doll Who Ate the Mother in chapter 1, and I remember literally sprinting there. If I could have elbowed people out of the way, I probably would have done it. But that was my moment. It was actually getting that book and getting my hands on that book. Although I'd read, a lot of horror, and I'd been reading your collections. And with the Parasite, I actually remember you writing once, I think on your message board, about you didn't particularly like it, but there were one or two good bits that you did like. What do you remember? What, I don't mean specifically the bits, but would it have been the narrative, the prose, the characterization that you liked?
A bit of both. I mean, I like some of the interaction between the characters. There's a late scene, funny enough, which is possibly the precursor of what I do now, where who the devil is it now? It's Rose, isn't it? Rose is our protagonist. That's right. And she has this extended telephone conversation with her father, and she thinks she's talking about her mummy, and the father thinks she's talking about money. And this, goes on for some little time. And obviously, this kind of, mishearing and misperception becomes central to what I do later on. I've got to say, that was autobiographical. I used to be like that when I was young. I would mishear what people said and be too shy to ask, well, what did you say? And so I'd have to live with what I thought I'd heard, which led to, many a jolly incident, let me tell you.
I think that's very English because the Polish don't communicate in that way. They're very direct, like a hammer sometimes, and you never left questioning what it is. And I think that's something that you do particularly well, because you just kind of led into my next question, because I know we've got 8 minutes before we stop this part, but I wanted to ask you about. So you, in my opinion, you're, the guys will agree, you're a master of that. The dialogue, someone doesn't know really what's going on, or they think they do, or are afraid, and it creates all kinds of problems. But when you, even when you were established, I believe that you used to send a style document with the, is that true, with the
Oh, I
submission?
still do. I still do.
So, so is that because some editors or publishers they don't actually quite grasp what you're doing with the dialogue, and they want you to be traditional?
Oh, I should say, really, when it comes to style, it's more a matter of just usage and a certain amount of punctuation that, I tend to is a little bit eccentric, and I prefer to have that kept if possible. And there's certain, I don't put commas between adjectives, for instance. I mean, mind you, probably just me pinching from William Faulkner there because he never did it either. But yeah, I just prefer it that way. I mean, I have to say that the copy editor at Flame Tree, I'm sure she won't mind if I name her, Imogen Howson. She's wonderful, and we work extremely well together, and she likes my stuff. So we've asked if we could, if she could just get my books when they're going into copy editing, and that works out fine. But I just send the style sheet round. Also, it's more probably to anthologies where you do sometimes get this of a house style. Well, I don't want to sound too kind of self-regarding, but I'd rather have my style than have the same story appear in half a dozen places in half a dozen different versions. Admittedly the changes will be only usually very slight, but I don't really want them. I remember this was funnily enough, this brings us all the way back, I think, probably to the Parasite. It was when Granada were doing the British paperback, and my editor, a great guy, Nick Austin, he'd gone on leave, and as it happened, it was at this point that the book went through copy editing by the actual editor at the publisher, rather than I think or maybe actually it must have gone via a copy editor as well. And one thing that had happened was they'd simply used the American text, and so for something like, I remember the specific one actually. It was somebody who was wearing a twin set. We don't even do these things anymore. And in America, that's a sweater set, basically. You see, and sweater set had crept through into the British version. So I said, oh no, edit that. And I remember this wretched woman who was not, as I said, was not Nick Austin, and was just somebody who was working on the book while he was away. And she said, oh well, it doesn't really matter because it's only horror.
Jesus Christ.
After you'd murdered her,
you may imagine my response. I think it was quite terse.
It's shocking though, because regardless of personal opinion, as a professional, as an editor, you need to be professional to all your clients.
Yeah.
Not cherry pick what your personal taste is. So that's but that's not really shocking, is it? I don't think any of us are really shocked either by that. We all know.
I was just about to say, sadly, that does not surprise me.
Yeah.
What people be snotty about horror? No, that's never happened.
Well, no, that's right. But I mean, you see, my point is that I don't have any field that depends more on the precise selection of prose for its effect than horror fiction.
Yeah. That's the irony. Yeah.
I mean, I know that one of the things that really annoys me when I'm reading a book is when you can tell that an author hasn't read the book aloud themselves to get the feel of the prose. Whereas actually I feel that horror is one of the best ones, where it's one of the reasons I like horror, because I don't find myself getting annoyed at the fiction like I do sometimes if I pick up. I can't think of it, but that kind of, I sometimes go, the author clearly they've just put words on a page. Horror has so very clearly been calculated together in a specific way.
Well, authors will think about that if they don't do it regularly, if they're going to give a public reading, and then they suddenly realize, like me, I can't even pronounce the word I've used. So it does come back to haunt some of them. It does come back to haunt some.
God, I can't imagine submitting a story without having walked up and down my room, reading it aloud to myself 3 or 4 times, just kind of scratching bits out, going, nope, I need to rewrite that sentence before I send it off.
Yes.
Right. So before we go into the the third part about Ramsey's film, TV, and book choice. Trevor, you had a question that you wanted to ask Ramsey about his writing and his publishing and books.
Yeah, I was really specifically about the influence, and personally, one of the most profoundly unsettling literary characters I have encountered is Queenie
Uh-huh.
from the influence. I was just really asking, only ask a general sort of question about the influence in Queenie's creation and sort of how that all came about, essentially.
Well, I think it was mostly parental panic, as was the Nameless,
Yes.
that having kids, you start worrying about them and worrying about the worst that could happen to them. Now, interestingly enough, I remember we had a discussion about this a way back around that time, I suppose. So Steve King, when they started having children, he seemed to be driven to write, the worst that could possibly happen. So you get Pet Cemetery, which actually
Yeah.
disturbed him so much he didn't even want to complete the novel, but eventually did. James Herbert, once he and his wife had children, he couldn't write about children having anything terrible happen to them anymore. So I think in Moon there's one child victim, but it turns out not to be the one we're sort of invested in, but somebody
Yes.
who is off the page, if you like. But in my case, again, it was just the nightmares get onto the page basically. And so in the case of the influence, I suppose in a way it was no less of heredity. And would my mother's condition possibly show up in our kids? Well, no, as it happened, but for a while that was a bit of an ongoing dread.
Yes.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
didn't you mention this, Ramsey, very early on in the introductions of one of your books that you got to the point of saying you also were going to make a conscious choice not to write scenes so much if they involve children because of this parental dread.
Yes, perhaps so. Well, I think it's more, I wouldn't have written a story like The Trick, for instance, which is a pretty, pretty relentless story about children in peril, and indeed The Interloper, Errol
Yeah, I was
Undercliffe,
just about to say. Yeah.
Errol Undercliffe wrote that, so I'm not taking any responsibility.
And Ben, you had a question for Ramsey.
Yeah, no, it was just obviously because you're, as well as being a bibliophile, you're very much a cinephile. Was there a specific trigger for you writing Ancient Images? Because obviously it's a very strange love letter to cinema, but it is the love letter to cinema.
Yes. I think it was just, I love the idea of a lost film, and how I could then play with this. And obviously, once you have the notion of a lost film, we come to the question of why has it been lost at all, and what has caused it to be, and quite possibly why should it stay lost for the good of the rest of us. And I because I love the old Universal horror movies with Koloff and Lugosi, I decided I was going to have them in the film, and the whole notion of the mid-30s doldrums of cinematic horror, caused largely because of the BBFC's attitude to horror films, which made them eventually bring in the H certificate. In the meantime, both Koloff and Lugosi did come to Britain separately and make films, to keep going. I just thought, well, why can't we have them make one together and possibly make a horror film, because it was a possibility, and so Ancient Images came about. I do agree with S.G. Joshi though that the two elements of the book, the business about the red fields and the cursed image in the film, they don't quite come together. They feel a bit like two separate strands of narrative. And so I had another go with The Grin of the Dark, about another kind of lost film, in this case lost silent comedy by a silent comedian who's been almost expunged from the record, and why this is. And dare I say it, I have in mind to write yet another book about a film and its continuing influence, and that might be the one I write next, but that's nowhere near starting yet.
Sorry, Ben. Go on.
It's just because Ancient Images is my favorite of your, certainly of your novels.
Aha.
And it's just, yeah, it's, I think it's, I don't want to say it appeals to a certain generation because I'm not that generation at all. But I think there is an element that most people who love those Universal films, and actually to a degree all the Hammer ones, will almost love it even if there are plot contrivances.
Right,
Because the idea of, very few of us get to cast Karloff and Lugosi and things. So to do it is quite a fun thing to do.
That's very true.
When I was reread, because I've been rereading a lot of your works recently, not for this podcast, just for the sheer enjoyment of it. And when I was reading Ancient Images, I remember the first time I read it, and many of the times afterwards. Now that I'm nearly 55, and when I look at it, it's actually quite interesting as a snapshot of the times, of attitudes and technology and everything that was going on in those days. But what I noticed, and what I want to ask you about now, in that book, you have that undercurrent of people, the former crew on the film talking about, the idea is that in when you were writing that, films are no good anymore. And now we're in 2026 and we're in a different period. And I regularly hear people talking about how films are not as good as they were in late 70s or 80s. And I have lots of different opinions about that. Do you think that's a recurring theme within the horror genre itself? Not people criticizing the genre, but people within the genre criticizing the genre compared to what they grew up with.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, very much so. Yes, I think it will always be thus, I suspect. Whatever seemed to you at the time when you came into it to be, what horror ought to be, is going to color your view forevermore. Sure.
I think
Absolutely, yeah. Nostalgia is a very powerful tool.
Oh, yeah.
I think they call
In
it
many ways.
I think it's called anemoia, which is where you have a version of reality that actually never existed in the first place.
Rose-tinted glasses.
Yeah, or I think it's called like faux-stalgia, that kind of like, you're idolizing a time that never actually existed.
Yeah.
But I think for the horror genre, it's a particularly destructive because people spend so much time talking about people not taking it seriously. And then when you move into a new era, and because youth has been left behind, they do the same thing that the people they were fighting with in the first place about take this more seriously, and say no, there are no new directors or modern directors doing anything interesting, which is just totally not true as far as I'm concerned. There's always something new. And I think that's like shooting yourself in the foot. It's like I've recommended films to people in the past and they've said, I'm not going to watch it. And I'm like, but why not? And it's like, well, oh no, it's not going to be as good as this. Is it a rip-off of this? And it's like, just watch the film and make up your own mind. And I think it's lazy thinking. It
is indeed. And I'm going to throw in one film here, even though it's not my one that I'm going to talk about in a little bit. But I think some of you have seen The Moor.
Yeah.
I haven't, but I've seen it recommended.
Well, highly recommended. I mean, I think it is, I suppose, the classical horror fiction, supernatural horror fiction, as any films I've seen for quite some time. And I think it's extraordinary, and I hope it gets more of a release, actually.
I think they did a Blu-ray of it.
Somebody recently mentioned it, but the reason I think I noticed it, Ramsey, is that they said that it was very similar to something that you'd done in fiction.
Yes,
did you feel that when you
certainly felt some affinity with it, yes. And I think partly because whereas there are certain images that most, I mean, all right, it's a way of doing it, but most directors would probably make it into a set piece. They would have things happen. For instance, these mysterious stones, standing stones that appear on the moor during the course of the narrative. And, there's a distinct sense, it's a bit like Feldstones, although I did meet the screenwriter and he had not then read that novel. So it's not imitation, it's just, similarity. But in the film, other directors would probably have them, CGI on the march. Yeah. The film just has them there where they shouldn't be. And to me, that conveys infinitely more dread than, having them, do a dance, basically.
And Ben, you've seen them all.
Yeah, it's very Arthur Machen,
Yes.
I think, in a
Right,
lot of
yeah.
ways. I know someone who you've had on the podcast recently, John Probert, was a really big fan of it. It was his, I think, his favorite film of 2023.
All right,
Ah.
okay.
Yeah, no, it's very. I mean, your entrance to it is there's a bunch of child abductions.
Hmm.
But I think it also works as one of those horror films where if you look at the first scene and look at the last scene, you
Mm.
can't work out how they connect.
Yeah,
How we
yeah,
got there? Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, sometimes that's because it's bad plotting, but in some ways that I love those kind of films where you kind of go,
Mm.
it's so weird and it's so off kilter. You don't quite know how you've got there.
I'll have
Yes,
to
yeah.
watch it. Yeah. I'm actually
Yeah.
going to see, after we record today, I'm going to see Hookum, which, which is from the Irish director Damien McCarthy, I believe. Yes. So,
Yeah, it's
yeah.
got
Who did,
Adam Scott in,
Yeah.
I think.
pardon?
It's got Adam Scott in. He's the
Yes, that's
does.
correct. Yeah, yes, yeah. And but McCarthy's previous film, Oddity, is worth looking at as
Yeah.
well, I would say. Yeah.
Yeah. Very good film. I just have one final question about your books. You made a statement once about Midnight Sun that you were, in retrospect, disappointed by it, Ramsey, which I find incredible because that book is very important to me. But I mean, it's important to me. That's irrelevant. But why are you not so happy with Midnight Sun so many years later?
Let me say no, actually, I've changed my mind.
Oh, okay, good. You should.
There was much more at the time. I felt, I'd just not achieved what I set out to achieve. But the relatively recent reissue, I reread it, well, obviously, for proofreading. And I felt actually I was too aware perhaps of what I'd set out to do to be able to see what I'd actually done, if you see what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
And looking at it now as itself, I think it does bring off far more in its own way, and there is a sort of sense of cosmic horror to it that is more than I realised was there. So no, in fact, I used to regard it at best an honourable failure, but now I think it's more successful than it seemed to me at the time. So I've become rather fond of it.
There was one more question I wanted to ask you, which was connected to the Midnight Sun, but it's completely slipped. This is why I've got notes, because I'm crap if I don't
Yes,
write. If I don't write.
Wait till you get to my age, man.
Oh, well, if I get there, Ramsey, I'm hoping. Yeah, but you never know.
I still think one of the best quotes about your fiction, full stop, Ramsey, is from Grady Hendrix, which is Ramsey Campbell writes like a schizophrenic thinks.
Yes, I've read that quote. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I put it to you in your 60 years interview that I did for Phantasmagoria.
That's right.
But yeah, I just think that's the perfect summary of why you terrify so many people.
Yes,
I would go with the Stephen King quote about Ramsey's work, about how it feels like being on an acid trip. I'm paraphrasing.
Yeah.
But nobody's told you that you've actually taken acid. So
yeah. And having experimented with acid when I was a young adult, I can honestly say that's a very accurate way of describing.
I think that's why it resonates with me as well.
Maybe that's why it doesn't resonate with me, because I've never done acid.
And don't, Ben. Okay. Don't, Ben. Yeah, just say no to drugs, Ben.
We're just sycophants, aren't we? We're just cozying up to him at this point.
I remembered what I wanted to ask you, which is when I read The Midnight Sun, it's only one of several books written about that season that I actually felt genuinely like I was cold reading it. The only other book that come close to it for me was One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which is set in a gulag. But I had that similar feeling about I actually felt it. And I think that's just because alone of the prose. How difficult is it? Because I did that with a novel, and it's not a very good novel, but how difficult was it for you to maintain in prose descriptions of cold weather without repeating yourself? Because you never repeated yourself in that at all.
Yeah, well, that's what I tried not to do. I must admit. Yeah, that was one of the main tasks or efforts, whatever you want to call it. One of the things that I tried to concentrate on. And I've got to say here, actually, and I don't know whether anybody's ever really made this comparison, because I used to think when I completed Midnight Sun, oh, they're just going to say, people would just say, oh, well, it's poor man's ballad, it's poor man's crystal world.
Yeah.
I don't think anybody has so far. Now they will, no doubt, but there you go. But I took Ballard as a model. And I mean, in the crystal world, he has these extraordinary descriptions of crystallization, and he never repeats himself. So I tried to learn from him.
Yeah, I can only think of one other book, I think, Smealer's Feeling for Snow. Have you read that, Ramsey?
Oh, no, I've not, though I know of it, no.
Yeah, so those are the books I think, because I think that's extremely hard, isn't it?
Oh, well, no, I'll tell you what, Anna Kavan.
Oh, Ice.
Yes,
Yeah.
there's one to try.
Okay, no, I don't know that one.
I thought the story was okay, but the sense of atmosphere was very, very good.
Yes, absolutely.
You feel cold reading it.
Oh, yes, very much so.
Excellent. Right, we're going to move on into the third part. And the third part, as every guest I've had on the podcast, which is they have to choose one film, one TV or streaming show, and one book that they'd really like to talk about. And Ramsey, where would you like to start? Film, book, or TV?
I have no preference. You start me off.
Let's start with Pale Fire.
All right. Okay. I did say earlier on that, Lolita, when I was just turning 17, was a huge revelation to me. And, in terms of all sorts of things, that in terms of the sheer relish of the English language, which I suppose to some extent, that comes out of it not having been his first language, but by gummy, embraces it with, everything in his being, I think. But the play with narrative, the extraordinary dark humor of the book, which took me very much aback. Why am I laughing? I didn't expect to laugh at a book about this sort of thing, but it's there, and that I suppose leads to the oblique approach to narrative. The breach, or more correctly, to the subject. All of which I then wanted to do. Now, having finished Lolita, I immediately went and bought everything else by Nabokov I could lay my hands on. So I got Laughter in the Dark, which is wonderful, Bed Sinister, which I think is in its own way a horror novel, extremely disturbing. But as good luck would have it, shortly after, Pale Fire came out in the first British paperback. And I remember being knocked out all over again. And for people who don't know Pale Fire, it is a novel in the form of a 999-line poem and several hundred pages of critical analysis of the poem. And it's very funny, it's extremely suspenseful, it's very disturbing. And if you don't know how any of that could possibly be the case, the only thing I can say is read the book and you'll be astounded. And again, I took all sorts of things from that book. I think the wordplay, John Kinboat, or the various permutations on that name throughout the thing alone, are worth your however much it would cost you these days. All the 5 shillings by gum when I bought it, and I think I still got that copy somewhere. So, in fact, I think somewhere on one of the recommendations they say they recommend you buy 2 copies of the book so you can have, the poem and the exegesis side by side, which is no bad thing either. But buy yourselves at least one. You'll be glad you did.
I remember you. Sorry, Ben. Go on. No, you speak.
Yeah, because I've never read it, but when I read, so the only Nabokov I've read is Lolita. But I always felt that it was actually, because I've watched the film, the Kubrick film as well.
Oh yeah.
That I
There
always
was a
got
remake as well, I believe, with
Adrian Lynn. Adrian Lynn.
Yeah.
But it sounds quite kind of like, or rather, I think his writing style is almost very kind of like Lars von Trier-y.
Ah, yes.
That's kind of like not mismatched, but it's kind of, you feel it's 2 elements that you think shouldn't go together, but do.
Yeah. Oh yes, very much so. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I the first thing I read by him was Mary, which was I guess it's a novella.
Oh,
And I and
Yes.
I, I remember reading that, but there's a big jump in terms of how he structured stories from that, because that's kind of straightforward. I read
Mm.
Pale Fire at university, but I had to read up about it again last night because I'd forgotten so much about it. But I
Yeah.
do remember, Ramsey, you saying that Nabokov is is it still true that is probably the most influential writer on you in terms of what to do with language?
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
yes. I mean, Lovecraft to begin with, but Nabokov subsequently. Yeah.
Because you used Nabokov to say to other horror writers, which I think is very important, read outside the genre.
Yes. Oh, yes.
Well, Trevor and Ben, do you read out? I don't want to put you on the spot like I'm checking you here, but what do you read outside the genre that's not horror when you have the time?
Usually non-fiction,
Yeah,
to be honest. In terms of my fiction reading, it's always really sort of been horror with some science fiction, less so maybe fantasy. But basically, a lot of stuff I would have read, even in more recent years, would have been, to be honest, books about atheism, religion, and
yeah,
a personal fascination of mine. Would have read stuff by, I'm talking about nonfiction, obviously, by people like Christopher Hitchens and Richard
yeah.
Dawkins and stuff. It's just I went through a phase in my life where I was
Searching.
questioning everything. Yeah, I was searching for big answers, and it sort of led me to the works of Hitchens and Dawkins. But that of course is non-fiction. But in terms of fiction, uh, horror essentially is and science fiction, weird fiction in general, has always been my go-to.
And Ben, it's a bit of a stupid question for you because you're reading classics, aren't you, at Newcastle University?
yeah.
Yeah, so
Um,
it's a
I mean,
redundant question for you.
yes, I mean, so yes, I have, especially in recent years, I've had to study a lot of, I mean, one of my modules at the moment is Herodotus,
Yeah,
and despite being, however, you know, however many people have tried to imitate him, he's still unique. But no, I do read outside the genre in terms of what I just read for fun as well.
yeah,
Um, I'm in the, I mean, in fact, I'm rereading one of his novels at the moment. I do love the works of people like William Golding,
yeah.
Yes, yes.
which they feel like horror even though they aren't.
Well,
So I,
I was going to, yeah, I was going to say I have read some classics by the likes of Golding and stuff, and Orwell and stuff, which wouldn't be horror as such. But yeah, sorry, Ben, I interrupted you.
no, I suppose that's where my kind of like fiction things, like if I'm not reading horror, I like stuff that makes me feel the same way that I do reading horror, even if
Yeah,
it's not.
I
So
mean,
like,
I agree.
Pincher Martin, I think, has a certain element of that. I remember.
yeah. Well, the one I'm rereading at the moment is The Spire,
Oh, yes, yes,
which
yes.
feels, which I think I'm only about 50 pages in. It already feels like a cosmic horror novel. Like I'm
Yeah.
expecting it to go into some weird like cultist thing, and
Yeah,
it doesn't.
yeah,
But
yeah.
but no, I do think it's one of those ones where I get very annoyed with people, and I'm sure you do as well, Ramsey, where people kind of they criticize a genre, but then when you ask them about it, they clearly haven't like they've only
Yes,
read like two books in it or whatever.
yes, yes.
No, you've got to like you can't criticize something without understanding it first.
Sure, absolutely.
Well,
Or at least
unfortunately,
watching or reading it. Yeah.
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 But the world we live in, Ben, people actually do think they can criticize it without reading
Oh, I
it.
know, but it really annoys me. It's like I want to just pick up a hardback book and just beat them around the head with it.
Yeah.
Um, totally understand your point of view there, Ben. That's why there's a forest near me with lots of shallow graves, but that's for another podcast. Ramsey,
Don't
now
go
we're
in
going to
Ramsey's
move on.
garden then.
Sorry,
Don't go in Ramsey's garden then.
Yeah, yeah.
who do you think I learned it from? Ramsey, I want to ask you about your TV choice, and you've chosen a classic for the genre. You've chosen The Stone Tape.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Still remember the first time Jenny and I, and actually Jenny's brother and his wife, they were staying with us. When it was shown on, I think possibly Boxing Day night. It was certainly over a Christmas. It wasn't it wasn't a Christmas ghost story or ghost story for Christmas as such, but it was the first broadcast. And at the end of
Yeah.
it, none of us wanted to go upstairs by ourselves, basically. So there's a great tribute to Nigel Neal. I mean, to my mind, at his best, Nigel Neal was incomparable. I mean, I would say for me particularly, the first three Quatermass serials and films, actually, and the Stone Tape are probably, in terms of his film output or television output, the absolute peak. I have to say, I do find some falling away later on. I'm not the hugest fan of Beasts, and I thought the final Quatermass, the fourth one, was a bit flabby and
with Sir John Mills. Was that with Sir John Mills?
Yeah, that's what John Mills is very good, but but I think, well, is it possible even to blame Pierce Haggard to some extent, because I know he made that and Blood on Satan's Claw, but I never thought he had that much of a feeling for the field. But perhaps I'm being unfair. And it may have been to some extent that the fourth Quatermass script was it was in limbo for too long, and time had passed on. However, that's not really what I'm here to talk about. The Stone Tape, I think, is a classic instance of how Neal would take, well, two things actually. I mean, I don't know if he ever read Lovecraft. He certainly never acknowledged any influence, but I think that there's a distinct affinity with this whole notion of taking the supernatural and then kind of merging it with scientific possibility, and in some ways, as Richard Matheson did in I Am Legend, taking a sort of familiar notion of the haunted building in this case, and then taking it to scientific realms. It also has one of those great ideas that the rest of us think, why didn't we think of that? Which of course is the idea that if indeed a haunting is in some way recorded on the fabric of the building where the events took place, then can't we use that medium as a new recording medium? And of course, things go horribly wrong in the Stone Tape. And that was another aspect, I think, of Neal's genius at his best. He has this method of gradually revealing things, and then there's something beyond that, something worse that leads to. And so that goes on until, as far as I can see, at the end of Stone Tape, we actually go into something cosmic, something utterly alien out there that is roused. And I mean, the special effects are perfunctory, but I still found it, completely satisfying and terrifying. And we often rewatch it.
Certainly the way.
Also, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, certainly the way Peter Shashti films it towards the very end with the special effects makes you think he's going for cosmic horror, even if he doesn't necessarily quite achieve it with the special effects he's got available.
Yes, I think that's right.
Yeah.
Sorry, Trevor. Go on.
There's also that sort of playing with the it's been a few years since I've watched the Stone Tape, but I remember that playing with a building being actually sentient or in some shape or form. But we obviously got with the likes of The Shining and stuff, and other fine examples. But relating to the cosmic sort of side of it, also in Nigel Neal's later uncredited Halloween 3, there's that element there as well, especially with Stonehenge and stuff, so there's that sort of theme there as well. It's
a film I pretty well like. I mean, there are moments that are unfortunate. I mean, if these these whatever they are, the androids are capable of pulling somebody. They don't need a power drill to kill somebody, then, do they? But which is just one sort of graphic scene too far, I think. But I do think Halloween 3 has a lot going for it, and it feels a lot more like Neal than he gave it.
Than Carpenter.
As indeed does Prince of Darkness, which he didn't write.
Yes.
Which is John Carpenter's tribute to Nigel Neal.
I think if you took all the bit with Stonehenge, where they've clearly, I don't quite know how they've shipped this bit of Stonehenge over to America without.
There's a one-line fix, I believe.
But either way, however they've done it, I do think it's if you took that as an isolated scene, that's like Neal almost unfettered. Maybe not the rest of the film around it, but just that scene on its own is just unfettered Neal.
Yes.
Great. And now we're going to move on to your film choice. And I have to admit, I didn't even know the film existed until Ramsey
Good
recommended it.
Lord. Well, I've done something good then. Okay.
You have, Ramsey. Ben did know. Trevor, I don't know if you'd known of the film before.
Hands up. I'm in the same boat as you, Frank. So thank you, Ramsey, because you introduced us to it, and I really liked it. Yeah.
So the film is, Ramsey, what's the film?
The film is Joseph Losey's The Damned, which he made for Hammer, based on a novel which I'm afraid I haven't read, called Children of Light, which I think has the basics in it. And it's Joseph Losey. Now, I've got to say, well, I don't have to say, but it's a bit of context. And I've been looking at all of Losey's films for a big article I'm doing for the Hammer people, you know, the new resurrected Hammer, revived Hammer Studios, and they have a magazine. It was originally going to tie in with their reissue of and 4K restoration of X the Unknown, with which the film itself, we gather, Losey was to a certain extent involved, although I don't think we're ever going to be able to pin down exactly how much. The Damned was the only film he ever made for Hammer. It's his only science fiction film, and it's set in Weymouth, and it involves a motley group of people: an American, visitor, a Scottish scientist, I think he is Scottish, Alexander Knox, a Swedish sculptress played by Vivica Lindfors, and a gang of the local ruffies led by Oliver Reed and also with Shirley Ann Field. And they're all pitted against, or eventually all apart from Alexander Knox, whose project it is, they all stumble upon this installation under Weymouth where children are kept, and as it turns out, they're being made radioactive in preparation for the apocalypse. They will be the only people who will survive. And it's an extraordinary sort of confrontation of various different elements that, done in a way that Losey was remarkably good at. But I think one of the things that always stay with me, from the very first time that I saw the film, because Hammer sat on it for a couple of years, they had really no idea what the hell to do with it. And they eventually released it on the bottom half of a double bill with Maniac, the Michael Carreras movie, which is one of that whole bunch of Jimmy Sangster, psychopath kind of psychopathic killer movies. But soon The Damned came on the screen, just that very poignant opening music by James Bernard. I knew we were in for something special here. And to my mind, the last 5 minutes of The Damned are among the bleakest in all British cinema.
Yeah, definitely.
It is poignant. Very bleak. Yeah.
Having said that, another Losey film that's equally poignant and bleak is The Criminal with Stanley Baker, that he'd made a couple of years previously. I suppose the other thing, well, I could go on about this film for a long, long time, but Losey originally worked with Bertolt Brecht on the first American production of Galileo with Charles Lawton as the central character. And Losey did often go in for the Brechtian effects. Now, one of the things that some people found too much to take too overt, if you like, in The Damned, is the introduction of the motorcycle gang by this song on the soundtrack, Black Leather Rock. But I mean, that's absolutely deliberate. It's meant, to sort of take you slightly back from the film and place you in a kind of, remote position as an audience watching and analysing. That's exactly the point of it. But the thing about this, you see, is that Losey was not here and certainly in The Servant, and I beg your pardon, The Servant is later and is one of his greatest films. In The Criminal, I beg your pardon, he's using these methods, whereas the British New Wave is being hailed a few years later as being the saviors of British cinema and the true originals. Well, actually, something like This Sporting Life is wonderful, but a lot of the British New Wave is imitation French New Wave, imitation Kurosawa, imitation other things. Whereas Losey was being wholly original, but because he was working within things like the crime movie and The Criminal and the science fiction movie and indeed the Hammer film in The Damned, he was just ignored. And to my mind, his achievement is infinitely greater.
So, Ramsey, you just eloquently described Joseph Losey's The Damned. Also in America, it's known as We Are the Damned. They Are the Damned.
These are the damned.
These are the damned. You've got it at last. Yes.
These are the damned. Why? I know they do that with a lot. They did that with a lot of films in America. They gave it a different title. Did it clash with another film at the time? Because The Damned's a title that's been used quite a lot, I think.
That's right. Yes, I don't know that there was another such film around at the time. There is the Visconti, but that's later.
Yeah.
So I really don't know, but they tend to fiddle around with titles, as we all know.
I think they sometimes just change the titles because they could.
Well,
yeah, I
was that half the time.
The most bewildering one is the Anthony Mann movie, Bend of the River, which becomes, as it crosses the Atlantic, it becomes Where the River Bends. You may riddle me that if you can.
Right.
Ben, I know that you said you bonded with Ramsey over this film when you first met him. So what opinions, what insights do you have about the film?
Well, I mean, it was one of my. So I went through a very strange phase of I watched a ton of Hammer films during A levels, and I took absolutely none of them in because my brain was destroyed. So at the start of university, I went back to correcting this and started to rewatch them, and it was one of the first Hammer films I rewatched. So in my head, it's to me, one of the more important Hammer films. But no, I love it just because of I suppose, as Ramsey was intimating before, it jumps between about three eras. It kind of sits between about three eras and feels unique. Like, I don't know whether you agree with this, but I always think because there's a bit where there's the general who talks to them every day, played by Alexander Knox. It's an eerie, if not punchy, performance, but it's a good one, I think. That always puts me in mind of the also called the General in McGowan's The Prisoner.
And and Ramsey, he told me this yesterday. Ben was saying this, and I was like, being a prisoner fanatic, I was like, oh, really, is it? And then actually, Ben, I was like, Ben is spot on. As far as I'm concerned, I really do think it does.
Yeah, maybe not the first 20 minutes, but I think once they go out to the island bit and you get kind of underneath world, it's very much that kind of it's all about indoctrination, psychological warfare done on the quiet.
Oh, I would go back to the beginning with that song which Ramsey was talking about, and the way that Oliver Reed delivers his lines very differently than the rest of the cast. Almost like he's a character in a fairy story, and there's some extra hidden meaning to the way he's speaking.
Yeah.
I think actually that plays in much more with the Prisoner's more surreal episodes, because the Prisoner had your very kind of like straightforward episode, and then they'd give you a surreal episode, which is obviously where McGowan's love really existed. So I think it's got a lot of that, but I think the Prisoner influences, or the fact that it might have influenced McGowan, I don't know, I've never read anything about him saying that, it is a good one. I'm sorry, Ben, continue.
No, because I mean, certainly by the end, it's transformed into it's a Cold War paranoia thriller.
Yeah.
Which, like I was saying before, actually, if you like one of those things where if you look at the first image and look at the end, you struggle to work out how they connect, because we're introduced to the film via the mods and rockers culture almost.
Yeah.
But no, I think it's also if anyone's a kind of a devotee of Oliver Reed, I think it's one of his best films, because I think later in life he gets tarnished with the brush that he just played alcoholics and drunks and people who started bar fights. And that's not an inaccurate description, because he was getting typecast as the person he was in real life.
Yeah.
But even by Hammer, the next film he did after The Damned was Paranoiac.
Yes.
In which there's a very telling scene where he breaks a bottle and starts to trying to cut someone up in a bar. But I think it's one of his most layered performances. And if when people are talking about kind of the brush that he's tarnished with later on, go back and look at this earlier role for him.
Yeah, for sure.
I would agree with that. it is a quite layered character as well. You know, there's a certain tragedy to the character, you know, and why he's so overprotective of the sister. Definitely.
Yes.
I mean, I know something that Hammer demanded they tone down in the film, but I think is still very much there, is that there's an element of incest.
Oh, there's certainly a hint of
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
There is a suggestion, a big suggestion there. Yeah.
But I always think, well, if that's the toned down version that Hammer suggested, what might the original have looked like? But no, there's a number of other things that I love about it. But Oliver Reed is, one of the main ones. And I think by the end, also I think to do with that song, the end feels very much like Doctor Strangelove. You know, that kind of it's very bleak, but at the same time you're kind of laughing because if you don't, you'll cry.
Yes. Oh.
But no, I do think it's got, because Joseph Losey, obviously a famous anti-war, anti-bomb sentiment. Apparently on the set of The Damned, like when he'd take them out, all the cast out to lunch between like at the end of the filming or between, filming blocks. Apparently he would just spout anti-bomb rhetoric at them. I don't know how.
And also,
but
what I got from it as well, that it also predicted the thalidomide scandal, because there's this talk of the experimentation on the children's mothers when they were pregnant. That's how the experiments start, and I think it was around that time that the actual I can't pronounce it properly, thalidomide drugs were being used.
Yes, that's right.
Yes, so there's that sort of eerie sort of coincidence there, but great cast as well. Vicia Lynn, I'm probably butchering her name.
Vivica Lindfors.
Yes, who would later go on memorably in Exorcist 3 as Nurse X in a very creepy turn. Yeah.
God, is that her? Is that her? I didn't know that.
Yes, she's also in Creepshow.
That's right.
The happy birthday scene with a cake.
Yes.
But I think, I suppose going back to that whole, like, it straddles genres and eras in the same way that actually the cast go on to do lots of different things and so on. I think you also have the fact that Joseph Losey, he's an American director, but he's been blacklisted.
Yes.
Come over to Britain, and yet you don't feel like he's making an American film.
No,
it feels very British.
Yeah, but to the extent where I don't think you could make that kind of film in America, you'd end up with something like Children of the Damned, John Carpenter's Village of the Damned.
Yes.
Not just because they've also got the word damned in the title, though.
And also, there is a village of the original Village of the Damned sort of vibe about it as well. Obviously, with the children and stuff, the kids that are being experimented on.
I mean, that goes back to John Wyndham's The Midwich Cuckoos, doesn't it? And
yeah.
I mean, it's one of those ones where actually, in doing this, I dragged up my old notes that I made when the first time I watched it. Yes, so I could go on about this for a very long time, I think. But no, it's anyone who thinks. So my kind of way I've sold it to people in the past is anyone who thinks they know what they're looking at from the first scene. Prepare to be very, very wrong.
Well, I also, even with those opening scenes where the American guy gets beaten up by Oliver Reed and his gang, I got Clockwork Orange vibes. I know Clockwork Orange was several years later, but there's that whole sort of youth culture, rotting. They're beating up the older generation. There's that generational clash there, that sort of thing. But then, of course, it goes in a completely different direction.
I'd like to ask you, Ramsey, though, me personally, I'm not a big fan of the Hammer horror films that essentially are a franchise. I do like them, but I'm not as big a fan as Hammer's standalone films. Where do you stand on Hammer horror, for example, producing this kind of film and the Quatermass? I guess the Quatermass films are connected, but still, I kind of look at them separately. What's your opinion of the classic famous Hammer horror compared with its smaller independent features like this?
Well, I think that, I mean, I should say at once that The Damned is my favourite Hammer film, but by far. But you know, there are others I like a great deal, and I do like the early Terence Fishers. I think Dracula is something of a little miracle of condensation, narrative condensation. I also think it still works very well purely as a well, as the kind of horror film that it is. Brides of Dracula, I have a special fondness for. I mean, that's a lot more haphazard. It tries to contain a great deal more. I think precisely because it tries to do that, it contains a great deal that does work, along with some things that perhaps don't work quite so well. But it has that sense of a kind of, I don't know, a fecundity of invention that I like a great deal. Taste of Fear, the Seth Holt, is by far the best of the Jimmy Sangster, killer with the twist movies, because I mean, Holt was very much, I think, the best director to work with that kind of material. I think there's a distinct influence of Jacques Tourneur and Val Lewton there in some of the sequences. What am I leaving out? Well, the Devil Rides Out works very well. Although obviously, I'm no great fan of this sort of medieval claptrap, but I think within its own terms, it's a very persuasive and very effectively put together film. And after all, and the old crew, Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing, not Peter Cushing in that one, but the great Charles Gray as MacArthur, I think is deserves more than a mention. But ultimately, I suppose you're right that it's the sort of sports, the one-offs, the eccentric Hammer films that I like best of all. And The Damned is far more a Joseph Losey film than it is a Hammer film.
I mean, one I'm going to throw in there is one of Hammer's more experimental. It's from that same era, 1960. Never Take Sweets from a Stranger, which was in America branded as Never Take Candy from a Stranger.
Oh, yes.
It's essentially a public information film given 90 minutes to terrify.
Stranger danger.
Yeah, but it's got anyone who likes Ramsey's favorite Night of the Demon. It had, for me, Niall McGuinness's second best performance.
Oh, yes.
As this prosecutor who's absolutely tearing into a young girl.
Yes, indeed. Very much so.
No, because I do love their gothics. I think a number of their Frankensteins. So Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed, Frankenstein the Monster from Hell, The Evil of Frankenstein is just pure. It's not the kind of thing I choose to write, but it's the kind of stuff I choose to kind of inject into my veins to keep me alive. And
the Zombies, Vampire Circus, stuff like that. The old BBC Two, I believe, double late night Friday night double bills. Yeah.
I mean, don't get me wrong. I think Hammer brought out some absolutely rum stuff. Horror of Frankenstein is a suck. One of their psycho thrillers, Die My Darling, also known as Attic. It's a Richard Matheson script, and yet somehow it's the most boring thing you've ever watched. But
I feel loyalty towards Hammer just because I'm a horror fan, rather than I'm a big fan of, like I say, the franchise things. I do like Hammer, but I honestly prefer the standalone films. I know, Ben, you want to burn me at the stake for making such a statement, but we first have to be in the same room for that to happen, my friend.
No, I do think if you look at the competitors, i.e. Amicus and Tygon, I'm far more a Tygon man in some ways.
I'm more an Amicus man.
I would have a fondness for, the ball, I suppose, but Amicus,
I mean, they mastered the portmanteau, didn't they? So
their anthology films especially.
Yeah, I think Hammer also. I think actually, their franchises are what made them famous, but their standalones are often the most inventive.
Yeah.
Plague of the Zombies is simultaneously every zombie film you've ever seen, and also like no zombie film you've ever seen before. I do think, and Ramsey, you can possibly talk about more of this. Now that we're in a bit of a Hammer renaissance. I think it's getting reconsidered in a new light, because for the simple reason that a lot of the releases they're having to do are the ones they've got the rights to.
Yes.
which
Yeah.
are not the franchise ones because they're often owned by now they're owned by Studio Canal. So
Yeah.
we're releasing things. They're releasing things like X the Unknown and the
Yeah.
Quatermasses
Yeah.
and.
That's right.
But you know what we're overlooking? I just realized what the three of us are overlooking is your direct connection to not necessarily Hammer, but to the tie-ins that you wrote, the adaptions of the scripts of
Oh, the old Universals, yes.
yeah. How did that come about, Ramsey? I'll make this the last part of the podcast because I know people have got to go. But how did that come about originally?
Oh, well, it was just that Piers Dudgeon, who was, I'll say that again. Oh, it's just that Piers Dudgeon, who was my editor, my first British editor actually, at Star Books, who had himself been introduced to my stuff by Hugh Lamb, sadly no longer with us. And Piers had bought my, we was going to do the paperback of Demons by Daylight and The Doll, which his mother, and duly did those things. But he'd also done this deal with Universal for 6 adaptations of early up to Creatures from the Black Lagoon, monster films. And he originally wanted me to do all 6. Well, there were 2 werewolf films. I only wanted to do one of the ones I would have felt, too lycanthropic. And I can't swim, so I didn't say I could do the Black Lagoon either. So I ended up taking on those 3 that I did. And what I tried to do, I mean, basically, this was long before home video, you see. So in each case, they took me down to London and it showed me in a viewing theatre the film, and also gave me a copy of Xerox of the original shooting script. I remember sitting in the theatre, basically scribbling away my notes on the script as I was watching the film, and that was the only time I got to do that. And then I took it home and worked on it. And that was how it came about, really. It was originally going to be by Carl Thunstone, but then I remember that my old friend Mandy Wade Wellman, I'd pinched the name from a character of his, and he felt that, well, basically readers might think that he'd written the book, so suggested I should go for something different. And so Carl Dreadstone became, the house name instead. Walter Harris wrote 2 of them, but nobody now can remember who wrote The Mummy, and I suspect we'll never know. I have one anecdote to finish with here,
yes,
which will dismay everybody so much they won't want to speak to me ever again. I'm surprised Piers ever did. This was around the same time, a little bit later actually, I think. And I was in Piers' office, and we'd had a splendid lunch, as publishers tend to give you in those days. And he brought out a bunch of stills and said, look, that he'd been asked to make an offer on the adaptation, book adaptation franchise of these movies that were coming up. And did I feel he should, go in with a good offer? So he showed me the stills, and there were, people in spacesuits and stuff, and waving, blasters about, that kind of a thing. And I said, well, it looks like, sort of Flash Gordon sort of thing. So, maybe make an offer, but I wouldn't have thought it was that significant. Star Wars. So we didn't get the deal.
Right. Well, yeah, that's you blacklisted now, Ramsey. 45 years on.
Yeah.
At the next convention, Ramsey, why is nobody speaking to me? Oh, God.
There's going to be a load of people dressed as stormtroopers marching towards you, just ready to beat you up.
Thank you very much, Ramsey, for agreeing to take part today.
My pleasure, gentlemen. Thank you for having me.
An absolute pleasure. And Ben and Trevor, again, thank you for always coming on and saving my bacon, so to speak.
Anytime.
Thank you, guys. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So it's the end of the podcast. I'm going to count down. So it's 3, 2, 1.